Good evening, everybody. I'm David Page, the director here at Whitehead Institute, and I'd like to welcome all of you to Whitehead Connects with David Meeker. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Whitehead Connects is our signature speaker series that brings renowned industry leaders to Whitehead Institute. And this evening, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome David Meeker, who is President and CEO of KSQ, a biotech company with a proprietary CRISPRomics drug discovery engine. David was formerly the president and the CEO of Genzyme, a Sanofi company, a position he assumed when Genzyme merged with Sanofi in 2011. David has a number of other engagements. He is chairman of the board of Rhythm Pharmaceuticals and Trevi Therapeutics and a member of the board at Myokardia. He also serves on the boards of the Biomedical Science Careers Program, the Network for Excellence in Health Innovation, and the Dimock Center, a Boston-based community health center. We are very eager to hear David's thoughts on innovation and biopharmaceutical pricing. I hear rumors that his slideshow has the same first and last slide. And so without further delay, please join me in welcoming David Meeker.
So thank you, David, and hopefully we'll be able to handle the one slide here. So this is an unusual invitation, and like I said, I was thrilled to be invited to speak. I'm coming to a deep basic science institution, and I'm not bringing basic science. So that's my first disclaimer. But I am deeply indebted to the Whitehead because KSQ, the company that I am currently running, one of its founders is David Sabatini, who is based here at the Whitehead. And as David said, we're based on functional genomics. And so I am deeply indebted to the science that's come out of this and obviously the connection with David.
And I think another one of your founders trained here.
Phil Hahn? Jonathan Weisman. Jonathan Weisman, all right. So it goes even deeper, which is why I came, because I hoped I would learn something. I don't know if you'll learn anything, but I aspire to learn something. So pricing and innovation, they said you want to give a talk. I'm thinking, well, I'm certainly not going to come here and talk about functional genomics and what David Sabatini does in his lab. That would be embarrassing. So I thought I would talk about something that I know is frequently discussed, cocktail parties, more formal settings, which is industry pricing and the possibility that if we try to control pricing, what impact will that have on innovation? Will it kill innovation? And that's certainly an industry position. Don't do that because that will kill innovation. Whereas I think much of us as members of the public might say, well, pricing's too high. So I only have one slide. I only have one slide because as I'm thinking about this and what I might say and I realize, well, I don't have a lot of facts that are going to support my opinions. So I'm going to give you a lot of opinion, not a lot of facts, so there's no point in writing those down. But I will share one picture that I think may help communicate a bit of how pricing evolved. But what I do know, and this is still perhaps debatable, but amazingly, in 2020, 2018, there's a very high probability I'm going to die of a bacterial pneumonia. I mean, if you'd asked me that a decade ago, 2 decades ago, certainly, in the era of antibiotics, the idea that you would die of a bacterial pneumonia would be almost unheard of. But here we are, antibiotic resistance. You go in the hospital, it's more dangerous than it is being treated at home. We need a solution for that. Alternatively, I'm going to die of Alzheimer's with limited resources to care for me in a society that is being overwhelmed by the problem of Alzheimer's. And we could go on and on. But the point is that Alzheimer's specifically, it's not going to be cured by building more hospital beds, right? I mean, there's so many parts of our healthcare system where, we're investing at the wrong end of the problem, which is not to say don't do that, but the point is that if we don't have innovation, if we don't have some, new solutions, there's really only one way many of these problems are going to be solved, which is, through basic science and ultimately that application to drug discovery and new therapies. So this issue of pricing, I worry about it a lot. And I'm going to start with just a short anecdote, which hopefully will serve a purpose. So as David said, I took over at KSQ, a smaller startup. We're about 80 people. We were about 40 people when I joined a year ago. But I came out of a big company. In a big company, I never worried about my healthcare plan or anything. I didn't even know how it happened. I just went to the doctor. They said, you have a copay, and I paid my copay. But suddenly I'm in a small company, and I suddenly have to worry about healthcare plans, and we're a very small company, and so we got a lousy healthcare plan because it turns out you don't get a good plan until you have more employees, and so I'm learning about this as I go. And my first experience as a user of that plan was I take ranitidine, Zantac, so for acid reflux, a common problem. I've been taking it for decades. I've had my prescription filled, never thought anything about it. So I was getting ready to refill my prescription. And so what's my copay? My copay is $50. I go, $50? Wow, that's a lot of money for ranitidine, which I happen to know is quite inexpensive. And so that was through my PBM, my pharmacy benefit manager, who's overseeing our drug plan with my insurer. And so I go on the website trying to figure it out, and they very nicely direct me to my local pharmacy to see how my prices compare. And a 30-day supply of my 300 milligram ranitidine was $50. I said, wow, that's amazing. So CVS has exactly the same price that they're charging me for my copay for my 1-month supply. So I knew that wasn't right. So then I'm Googling further, and Walmart and my local things. And so of course you can get it more cheaply at some of these things. And so that was interesting. So at the end of the day, I went to Amazon, and I wanted 300 milligrams, which is a prescription, but the over-the-counter is 150. So at Amazon, I got more than a 3-month supply for $18, and it was there 48 hours later. So my only, this whole issue of pricing and who's paying for what and where the money's going and the like is, at best, it's complicated, right? And at worst, it's completely uninterpretable. And as a relatively, I think of myself as a relatively sophisticated user of the healthcare system, it was incomprehensible to me. And at the end of the day, I go where we're going to go for everything, which is Amazon, and it's going to figure it out for us, which is probably not optimal either. So, moving on from that, the first question about pricing, is it broken? And the answer, my opinion, is it's not broken, but there are certain pieces of this which are not right. And I'll tell you the first piece, which is absolutely not right, which is the year-on-year price increases that we as industry take. And this is a devastating potential problem to the overall ecosystem and how this works. The idea that you're increasing year on year, sometimes double-digit price increases without increasing the value just because you can, that is a problem. Now, I think we're making some progress on that, and in the past, 2 years, there's been positions taken by a number of the larger companies. Allergan was one of the first. Brent Saunders came out and said, I'm going to cap our price increases. Now, it was a pretty tentative step. He says he's going to cap it at 10%, and I think they took a 9+% price increase on their drugs, which is still quite high. But it was a step in the right direction. Sanofi, where I came out of, took a public position which says they were going to limit their price increases to medical inflation. Now, medical inflation is not the CPI. The cost of our healthcare is going up more rapidly than CPI, but again, that's in the range of 4 to 5%. And so, again, these are tentative steps that said, industry is beginning to self-regulate around this really important piece of the equation, which is proving highly disruptive. So, from that standpoint, I think there is good reason to hope. But I think if you really want to understand the pricing equation, you got to step back and put it in the context of the overall system. So our healthcare system in the United States, as you probably know, we send an amazing amount of money, $3.5 trillion, I think were the numbers that just came out for 2017, on healthcare as a whole. So 18% of our GDP, 17.9%. That's about double what other OECD countries spend on their healthcare. So they're in the range of 10, 11, 12% of GDP, somewhere down in the 5% range of GDP. The good news about that part of the equation is the numbers that just came out, the rate of growth is moderating a bit. So in 2017, we only grew by 3.9%. In other years, we've been well above the overall rate of growth of the economy. And so, in 2017, at least, we were a little bit below. So again, hopeful signs that things like that are maybe moderating a bit. The healthcare dollar, the way the healthcare dollar gets split up, which is also, you wouldn't necessarily know from the headlines, so about 20% goes to the physician side of the equation, about 30% goes to the hospital side of the equation, and about 14% goes to drugs. And there's also a bit of this is industry's argument that it's 14% and it's been relatively stable. The interesting thing is it is about 14% and it has been relatively flat. Now the overall, the amount we're spending is going up significantly because the total cost amount we're spending on healthcare has grown significantly, but that percentage has remained remarkably flat. And it's also interesting that if you look, no matter how much a country spends on their healthcare, that percentage, it's in that range of 10 to 15% that they spend on drugs themselves. So again, there's this part of the equation which has a certain balance to it, for whatever insight that gives us. So that piece of it. Now, in 2017, the increase in the drug budget was only, of the 10% that's spent on retail pharmacy, was only 0.4%. So again, here's a piece where we're seeing all these really high prices and the headlines and the like, but that part of the equation is staying really, relatively flat. And so, how does that work? And I'm going to come back to the high prices in a minute. So the reason that works is generics. 90% of the drugs we use are generic. And there's this contract, basically, that I believe we, within industry and all of us have with society, which is, yes, drugs are priced high when they first come out, but when they go off patent, then, essentially you've got, that drug at generic prices, which may be pennies a day for, the rest of our lives, statins being a great example. And there's many others, of course. Now, that's the chunk of the spending right there. The piece that gets the biggest focus and needs to be focused on, we need to talk about it, is what's happening with specialty drugs. And so the specialty drug world, and I'm going to include orphan drugs in this, really started with the orphan disease world. And Genzyme, so I joined Genzyme in 1994. Ceridase, which is an enzyme replacement therapy for Gaucher disease, was approved in 1991. Now, the story behind that, which maybe I know is well known by some of you in the room, maybe known by many, is Gaucher disease, a rare lysosomal storage disease. Originally, we thought there was a few hundred people, maybe in the US, maybe globally, that would need this therapy. The way the enzyme was made was it was extracted from placenta, and it took 22,000 placentas to make enough enzyme to treat one patient for a year. So there was this heroic challenge of trying to figure out how you could produce enough material and, of course, get it to the people who needed it. And that was solved, and Henry Tamir was leading Genzyme, and the visionary behind all of this, then had a problem, which is, how do you make a business? Because he needed to make a business. I mean, this was the first product at a small biotech company at that time, and if you can't make a business out of it, you can't be sustainable. And so at that point, the cost, said, okay, the cost is going to be $400,000 a year per patient. Now, that was unheard of at that time. There was nothing else that had that, and there was many articles written about the most expensive drug in the world and the like. And Henry went through a whole period of interrogation and testifying in front of Congress, opening the books. But it was basically just a simple thing, which is tell me what to do, and I'll work with that. But the reality is $400,000 is where we need to be. That simple fact, and there's been a lot of discussion around the Orphan Drug Act and what was that allowed patients with orphan diseases to get better access and access to more therapies. And a lot of that has correctly been attributed to the Orphan Disease Act. And the Orphan Disease Act was this legislation which basically said these diseases are so rare that patients with these diseases, the market's not big enough, so nobody's going to invest and work in them, and therefore we're going to give the companies that do work on them special protection. So a tax break, some protection after the drug's approved if it doesn't have other protection. But that was about it. What I can say pretty confidently, that was very important and very helpful. What transformed orphan diseases was when Henry priced Gaucher, the Seradase treatment for Gaucher disease, at $400,000. Because it suddenly said to the world, wow, you can make a business out of treating these very rare diseases. And the difference from that point forward is, as you probably know, there have been over 600 therapies since 1983 that have been approved for rare diseases, rare orphan diseases. And the reason I show you this picture is this is Robson. Robson is a Rogério Vivaldi, by any chance, is in the audience. Rogério was head of our Brazilian office at that time. He's currently a CEO in Boston. But Robson lived up the Amazon. And this drug, when it was approved, one of Henry's views about this whole thing, that healthcare is global. That you don't, as a U.S. biotech, it doesn't mean you can't think about the world outside the U.S. And if you have a potentially life-saving therapy, you need to figure out how you can make that drug accessible. And so, here's a kid up the Amazon who somehow found his way to a medical display meeting, or whatever. There was a medical meeting. We had a booth or something, and he showed up at the booth with this, and there's a whole story around how Rogério sort of begged, borrowed, and stole vials from somebody else to get him started on treatment. But my point here is that there is much more behind the pricing of drugs than simply making it available in a wealthy country that can afford to pay. And part of the challenge is how do you create a business model that allows you to provide that drug globally and to everybody who needs it. And in Henry's case, there were two prices. It was the price or free. And that was a model that we worked with as we tried to navigate these waters. So that set the precedent for this pricing model. And on the one hand, as I said, it was fantastic and probably one of the most positive contributions that could have been made to the orphan disease space. The other hand, there's some negatives that came with it. And over time, I think the whole concept of orphan disease pricing has been abused. And when I say it's been abused, there's a lack of understanding about how orphan disease pricing really worked. And the legislation for orphan that allows you to be designated an orphan disease in the United States, and the numbers are the same basically globally because all of the other legislations were built off the US, is you have to have fewer than 200,000 affected individuals, and then you would qualify as an orphan disease. And so what you will often hear is, oh, we're an orphan disease, we're going to get orphan pricing. But in fact, that's not how it worked. If you have 150,000 individuals who are affected with a disease, that is a very different opportunity than if you have 1,000. And the thing about orphan disease pricing is there's 2 or 3 critical elements, which is you need to have a life-threatening or severe disease. 2, you need to have a solution which is transformative or life-saving. And 3, your pricing should be a function of rarity. In other words, the more rare your problem is, the higher the pricing needs to be, in all reality. And it works for society because society as a whole, if you have 1,000 patients at $400,000 a year, that is a relatively small part of your overall healthcare budget, even though it's a very high price for the individual. On the other hand, you multiply that times 100, so you have 100,000 individuals in that case, and that's a very different challenge. And so I think we as a society are struggling with, or not, many of us are struggling, but there's an abuse and a lack of understanding of how this original piece came to be. So a second example in terms of specialty pricing, which I think also drove a lot of the focus and discussion, was Sovaldi. So Sovaldi is a treatment for hepatitis C. And it is a remarkably effective therapy. So you took a disease which did not have an effective therapy, which basically said, you went through a period of liver deterioration to liver failure and ultimately needing a liver transplant with very high costs, to now if you had hepatitis C, you could be potentially cured. So Gilead, no secret, came out at that time with a price for Sovaldi, which was $84,000, which basically the course of therapy worked out to $1,000 a pill, and there was a lot of outrage. Now, as that problem, and it created a tremendous spike in the spending, many budgets, including most significantly Medicaid budgets, because many of the individuals who were affected were covered under Medicaid or in our prison system. And it was viewed as an incredibly negative thing. And I think what it was an example of what was not handled well. Because the interesting thing was, if you took the cost of Sovaldi versus the benefit, it was cost effective. You could make that case. Now, I'm sure we could debate that. But the point is, there was a calculation which said, in fact, at $84,000 on an individual patient-by-patient basis, that's a cost-effective therapy, and so Gilead did nothing wrong. Now, I think the challenge is actually, Gilead knew, so I won't speak for them actually, but I'll say, there was 3 million people, 3.5 to 5 million, there's different estimates I've seen, but let's use 3 million. 3 million people in the United States who had hepatitis C. Now, what happens if you have hepatitis C and suddenly a curative therapy becomes available? I put up my hand, I want that drug. And everybody puts up their hand in the first year, and so suddenly we're all looking to be treated in that first year with an $84,000 a year. And let's just do some simple math. Let's say it was $100,000, and all 3 million put up their hand. That's 300 billion. Now, there's no drug in the world that should have revenues of 300 billion. So, we could have done a much better job thinking through, how to do this, the timing, the, working with the healthcare systems in advance, thinking about this, and the net effect of all of this, which is another interesting point about how all this plays. That window where it was $84,000 was very short, because there was another drug very quickly that came in to the class, and then price was driven down. And this is what's happening in specialty therapeutics, and people do not see this as clearly yet. There's a few examples of it. The hepatitis C is one. Anti-PCSK9 is another. But people used to say, well, industry, you have this very long period of patent protection before we get to generics. That's true in a number of cases. What's actually happening at the payer level now is, it's not that they're looking for the generic to lower the price. It's if you have 2 drugs in the same class and they have relatively comparable activity, efficacy, and safety, the payer will put those head to head. So anti-PCSK9, which was a marvelous therapy, is a marvelous therapy for high cholesterol. 2 drugs came out at the same time. They were put head to head, and the price dropped dramatically. In the PBMs, the list price remains high, but the discounted price that is being paid by most of the plans, we have a problem with equity across our system, but this idea that you will be put head to head, not against your generic, but against somebody else in the class, is very much part of this equation. And the length of time that you are alone in your class now has dropped to a little over 2 years, 2.3 years. So we actually have market forces that are working in our system. They're just working imperfectly. And then the last part of this special equation, which we need to think about, there's many parts, but cancer. So oncology, the science is better than ever, which is the amazing thing is. I mean, it's just incredible what science can do now, and what's being, diseases are being broken apart, our understanding, the genetics behind many of these diseases, and the ability to connect, patients with, the treatment that will work for them. One of the reasons this equation works is 100% of the people who get treated with that drug need it and benefit. If you don't have Gaucher disease, there's 0% chance you're going to get that therapy. Whereas for many of our diseases, you get drugs and we don't know whether they're really going to work. They may work for 40, 50, 60% of those who get them, but 40% are getting it unnecessarily. That's being changed, and so we're shrinking the population, so we're going to have some high prices. But the challenge with cancer is, so we can debate whether the prices where they're being set now make any sense at all, but what I do know is, even though the increase in lifespan may be 4 months, we need that 4 months. Now, if I'm an individual with that cancer, I may appreciate the 4 months. But as a society, we need the 4 months because the next 4 months is going to build on that 4 months. And if we shut down and set the bar and say, look, we're not paying for anything unless you can prolong life by 2 years, we're not going to get there. Because it's very rarely that we get there, of course, in one big leap, right? We're incrementalists. We build on all these things and the like. So there's a lot of different pieces to the specialty, part of the pricing world here we need to think about before we react to the headlines. So innovation, the innovation, how does innovation work? So I suspect many of you in the audience are innovators yourself. You've been thinking about innovating, you're investing in innovating, you're benefiting from innovation. What we learned in industry was you cannot give $1 billion to really smart people and put them in the middle of a nice green field and expect to get a drug. You might get a drug, but you can't buy that outcome, because if you could, we'd have a ton of amazing drugs right now, right? We've run that experiment. It doesn't work. So as I think about building R&D organizations, and more than my current situation, it's a slightly different story, but at a Genzyme or a Sanofi, the goal of our R&D organization was to find a therapy, cure a disease. My expectation of that was we would not. But I wanted, and others who were working on that problem, we wanted to build a cutting-edge R&D organization that could see where the next idea came from. And to see that next idea efficiently, you have to be, I think, doing world-class research, because it's by doing world-class research that you're connected with other people in the field who are doing the same thing, and you can see these things in a way that if I just take a very smart PhD, individual and send them, go find me the next drug, won't be as successful at. So having a cutting-edge R&D organization allows you to see where that next idea is coming from, and it's going to come because we have this incredible network of academic labs, places like the Whitehead, small biotechs. This is where innovation is happening. It's hard to predict. There's a serendipity to it all, and where that next great idea. But once that idea pops, and NIH funding is an incredibly important part of this because it's funding stuff that doesn't link directly to a return. It's just funding good science. And that, you just need an unbiased source of funding that's not demanding that you get a return to be seeding this whole part of the equation. So we have to have that, but once that idea pops, we need a way to push it across, call it what you want, and that's venture money. And the amazing thing about the US, and why is all this stuff happening in the US, is because there is an amazing amount of venture capital available here. These individuals work globally and the like, and there's venture capitalists outside the US, but the venture capital network in the US is truly amazing, and the amount of money that they are willing to put at risk in a situation which defies, in a sense, reason. The probability that your idea, when you enter into drug discovery, will make it all the way through to approval is like 1 in 100. If you get all the way to a drug, the probability to make it through clinical trials is like 1 in 10. These numbers go up and down, but they've held remarkably stable. And so why anybody would invest in that is a bit of a miracle. But they do, and part of it is because when something does work, you get a return. So that piece of the equation is so incredibly important that we preserve. In 2017, I think there was like 15 billion. That was, again, how these numbers are calculated and like, so don't challenge me on those numbers. I think the takeaway was a big number. In 2018, it's been similar. So there's this incredible, and the total NIH budget is 37 billion. So this part of the equation isn't going to be replaced by somebody else. It's not going to be replaced by the US government. And the chill that will hit that if we start to think about controlling prices in a way where when things do hit, there isn't that ability to say, I have my chance at a return, I think is going to be incredibly difficult to sort. I thought I'd just spend 2 minutes telling you the KSQ story, because I think it's a good example of innovation and how this works. So as was mentioned, 3 labs, 2 connected here with the Whitehead, and the other one a block away, I guess. But they came together. 3 leading labs in the area of functional genomics. We use CRISPR Cast9. They enlisted our chief scientific officer, who came out of Novartis, was heading drug discovery, oncology drug discovery for Novartis, and that's Frank Stegmeyer. And Frank and his team basically took the CRISPR Cas9 platform and the idea of doing whole genome screening. So they had a very specific starting point, but then they enabled it. And they enabled it by several additional, call them next generation pieces, to allow us to screen at scale, to screen rapidly, to screen with greater precision, and to screen specifically in a T cell in an in vivo setting. So that latter piece is going to has already given us a lot of insights into the immune system, and to the extent that the immune system may be the ultimate solution to cancer. How do you get the last cell? Many therapeutics can reduce the number of cancer cells we have, but they can't get the last cell. The immune system in a hunt-destroy model certainly can get the last cell. And so they enabled that whole piece. And we've been able to raise, from a standing start, I mean, Frank was the 3rd employee in, 150 million. So that's in 3 different funding pieces. Now, if you think about in an academic setting and writing grants and the like, that's an unimaginable amount of money that allows you to accelerate things and bring brute force to an idea that's reached the point where it needs the extra push. And so now we have 12 different targets we're pursuing in drug discovery, and of course that's expensive. And the way we're doing that is we're working, so we're only 80 people, 40 last year. We have a network of 30 plus contract research organizations around the world. So lots in China, lots in India, some are in the US, and a couple in Europe. But it's this vast network, and as a tiny company with resources, you can access all of this. And again, you can do things that historically might have only been possible if you were part of a great big company. And so we've created this world where it can take advantage of the amazing progress that science has, and it can begin to push it. And we're getting, you're seeing results, and you're going to see more and more drugs that, approved, I think, that are going to solve some of these most, trying problems that we have. So in conclusion, maybe I just end, I think you've got my biases here. We need innovation to solve some of these most trying problems. These ideas will emerge, but we don't always know where they'll emerge from, and we need to be able to, the ecosystem has to be intact and supporting all these different places, because at any particular moment that cure for Alzheimer's may be sitting in the most unlikely place. And so hopefully the ecosystem is working, can find it, can support it, nurture it so it can pop in a way. We need venture capital. And every time Trump or somebody tweets and sends a chill through the stock market, that's just the stock going up and down. The funding will take a while for it to disappear, but I firmly believe that if we lose the freedom to price, we will damage this badly. Industry owns a big piece of this, and if we as industry don't get our hands around the parts of abuse, then we're going to be in a very weak position arguing that, we need help here, preserve our freedom to price in the face of abuse. So, and the last piece is, wherever you are in this equation, in whatever conversation you're in, don't forget that there's no thread that you can pull on without unraveling something else. We are all so tightly connected, and we got to keep working to massage, but arguing, let's be really careful about, blowing it up and thinking we can rebuild it. Not so easy. So thanks for listening. That's all I have. Have a good questions.
I'm sure David will take your questions.
And actually, I'm happy to take questions, but I'm actually even more interested in thoughts, reactions. That can't be true. Anyway, so yeah.
I understand you have to get a return on your investment, but why do Americans have to pay twice or 5 times as much for the exact same drugs as people in UK, Japan, Canada, et cetera?
Yeah, there's not a good answer for that. So when this Ceridase went out, the price globally was exactly the same. In fact, the price in Europe was higher than the price in the US. Over time, these other countries have taken a very different position, and as you know the story there, you have a single payer system. So the tension there is, you can, and some companies have, tried to hold the line, and unbelievably, there's a few examples now where people are refusing to launch in a, country. The delay between, this doesn't say why it's right, because it's wrong. The timing for drugs to be available outside the U.S. tends to be 1 year to 3 years beyond when we get them here because of working that through, and at the end of the day, yes, we negotiated a lower price. So it's not right. I don't know exactly how it's going to play out. I can also tell you that there's a reason much of the innovation and investment in R&D happens in the U.S. When the UK shifted and became a much more challenging, we and others pulled out of the UK. And I had a number of conversations over my career where you'd have one conversation with the Minister of Trade and say, come, invest in my country, or you've got all these great little, tax perks and the like for you to do it. And the Minister of Health, which would say, we're not going to pay for your products. And my question back to all of them was like, why don't you guys, these things are not disconnected here. And so making Europe a more attractive place to invest, is linked to making it more hospitable, if you will. But no, that's a problem. I don't know how that's. I worry that'll blow up before it's solved in a thoughtful way.
Dave,
Mark.
Start off the conversation, the lecture, by talking about you're much more likely to die of bacterial pneumonia today. So we've seen, especially in the markets, anti-infective companies have a very difficult time getting financing. Certainly the orphan drug space has seen obviously a lot of growth over the last several years. There's lots of institutional money, venture money going to those companies. At some point, when will the capital market, when will VCs realize that we have to fund these new anti-infective companies, that are going to lead to drugs that will deal with the resistance factors?
I know there's some venture capitalists in the audience here who could probably answer that, but I'll give you my answer and welcome other thoughts. When there's a business model, so why do we have antibiotic resistance? Because we have excessive antibiotic use, and it's worse outside the U.S. So if you get a really amazing antibiotic, the first thing I'm going to do as a doctor is put it on the shelf, and I am not using that drug. I'm going to save that drug. So the paradox is the better the drug, the more likely it is to be saved and not used. So we need a model. We just need a completely different business model. And people are working this right now. I haven't heard a solution which resonates yet, but there's a different model which says, I'm going to pay for your non-use. It's like the farming community, which is, I'm going to pay you not to plant, right? That's the antibiotic model that we need here. But that's, I mean, the VC world is, I mean, it's like this. The importance of, health is personal. We all have a right to health. The importance of having a business model to create sustainability behind these things, is every bit as important as the science.
No, they have historically invested in these companies. Unfortunately, commercially, the value hasn't worked, right? The strategic market hasn't been there, so unfortunately it hasn't really come full circle.
But that's what back to the market. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think you, and then, sorry, you. Yeah.
There were 2 points. One is that in this country, the veterinary version of a drug is much, much cheaper than the human version for the same thing.
Yeah. So here, I left out a little part of what I was going to talk about. The cost of the drug itself. So for antibiotics, for antibodies, your biologics, they're more expensive, but they're still a small fraction of the total cost of the drug. So then you get into the fact, so where do the costs come from? And the famous 2.6 billion per drug, which is a tough study, and everybody debates, and they say, well, that's an industry number. It has a lot of things in it. It has opportunity costs. It has all your failures in it. But the point is, it is extraordinarily expensive, hundreds of millions minimally to develop these drugs, number one, and two, once they're approved, to support them. So the difference between the veterinary cost, it's not the cost of the medicine per se, it's all these other elements behind it. And the other thing is that in your portfolio, you may have a blockbuster, which is making you lots of money, has lots of margin. You probably have a number of other medicines which are on the margin. So it's very hard to get to, and this is what the society wants, which I totally get. It's hard to get to that straight line of saying exactly how do you calculate the cost, and it is this mix of tangibles and a bit of intangible, to be honest. So here, and then.
So you also some thoughts, also in addition to the question. And we as an industry, what is the fundamental goal of the industry? You want to innovate, come with new drugs, and you talk a lot about the freedom of pricing, you get a return on investment. But we step back from the whole thing. There's a whole mankind, global population, the global unmet needs. There are so many unmet needs, and I think the rate of innovation is very slow. And the rate of innovation, as the way you described it, directly ties the amount of money you spend. So there has to be a fundamental way of systematically increasing the rate of innovation, at the same time dramatically reduce the cost of innovation. And I don't see anybody talking about how to reduce the cost of innovation, because your fundamental cost of innovation is decreased. Then you can still get a decent return on investment, and a drug price can be fundamentally different.
Yeah, so totally agree. My point about the amount of time you are alone in your class shrinking to 2 years, I think all of those forces are in fact going to drive costs down, and I think the personalization of medicine, in fact, will make the developmental process easier. Right? I mean, if you've got if your drug works in 100% of the patients, then the number of patients you need for the trial, the amount you need to demonstrate efficacy, your safety, but everything becomes smaller. So I think we're getting there. I think that part of the equation is moving slowly, to your point. And your bigger question about how do we deal with global health, that's a big question. And they're linked, but we need both, right? I think we've got to let this part of the world, the developed world, continue to push, some of these higher priced advancements in science, and over time they will increasingly translate to this larger population that cannot access them today.
I'll make a couple of quick points. I think what happens in industry discussing the innovation, it appears that the cost of rest of the world, we think that a Gates Foundation will take care of it, or United Nations will take care of it. But it's not inherent in the thinking when a design stage of a drug that how do I make the drug also very, very affordable. Doesn't mean you have to cut corners or make it just as sophisticated. And second part about highly personalized medicine, in history is an indication so far. Highly targeted therapy is even more expensive.
Yeah, I think totally agree. So the question was, why aren't we paying more attention to how to make these drugs affordable? these drugs are being developed in the context of a portfolio or a return on investment by a VC. So I think these are the variables. That actual drug itself, a better manufacturing process, higher yields, a smaller trial, all of those are going to, decrease the upfront costs or the ongoing costs. But we're still going to be living in a world where we need to attract the investment that's willing to take the risk. And what I'm saying, that period of high prices, the time you're living with high price, that's what's going to shrink. And that'll shrink faster than the price shrinking itself.
So, great talk. A lot of concepts have already been out there, I think, you've spoken about. Just wanted to get to your point, that more personalized, more precision medicine. I mean, in some sense, more effectively, I've heard the quote that there are now 80,000 rare diseases that you can define out there, the under 200,000. And you hear people talking about cancer being personalized. So in effect, everyone developing a cancer drug says it is an orphan drug, it is this targeted. So when you stack that all up, it's not a small volume of patients. There could be several hundred thousands of rare now out there. So how do you think of, kind of, to your point, this abuse of kind of the orphan pricing model when people are applying it now to pretty much almost everything?
No, it's a good question. Did everybody hear that? I know it's hard. Yeah. So the question was, I talked about orphan diseases, particularly the Gaucher kind of example as being so rare, and you pay a high price, but there's only a few patients, so for society it's okay. But there may be as many as 80,000 rare diseases as more and more diseases get cut in a way that they fall below the 200,000. And so how do we think about it, and how do we deal with that? It's a bit of an old question in the sense that when these first came out, that was the fear. That was 20 years ago. So we've had 600 therapies for these rare diseases. In my mind, that'd be a good problem to have, because by nature, the prices won't stay where they are. But it's just not going to happen, right? I mean, at this point. I mean, the world will be very different before we get to that kind of magnitude. It's painfully slow. And the challenge, the reason it's so hard, there's lots of companies that are chasing rare diseases now, which is great. But the challenges are still there, right? I mean, some of these diseases that fall in that 80,000, there's 10 known patients in the world or one, right? I mean, so I just think we have to be careful about how we look at the numbers and not create fear that is, I think that's a genuine concern. In other words, I would want to be thoughtful about and aware of that, but I also would be very sensitive to saying, don't do that. I had a famous quote when this drug was first, actually it was the drug behind it, Fabrazyme, was first approved, and one of the people sitting in power in the UK over one of the health authorities was there, and they had rejected a drug, and they rejected the drug because it was going to be 50,000. They said, well, why did you reject the drug? Because if I didn't reject this one, there'll be another one and another one and another one. And so that's, I think, not a constructive place to play here, and I want to hopefully keep us on a different plane if we can.
So we talked about the funding for the whole exercise mainly coming from VC. So there are wealthy, small number of people willing to take the risk. Mm-hmm. But the consumer for drugs we develop are for everybody. So is there an alternative way so actually people can chip in small pieces, but all add together in a big amount? That if it works, then everybody actually benefits.
Yeah. So it's interesting, and so crowdsourcing kind of solutions, and I'm sure there's examples of that. I don't have one off the top of my head. So it's a good question in that sense. One of the things that has happened and very powerfully has been venture philanthropy. So the patient organizations themselves, and Cystic Fibrosis Foundation was an early example of this, a powerful example where they're able to raise money at a level that allows them to actually dictate, to a certain extent, the research agenda. And then they take a position, and the drug's commercialized, and they get the part of the reward there, and then that money can be channeled back into other research. So I think these kind of things are happening, but we're still a long way from that being able to replace the kind of dollars that are being, people are willing to put at risk today. That's moving things in quite a powerful way here. Regina, then you, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to kind of comment on what you said, there's a lot of factors there. I just wanted to comment on what you were saying, that there's a lot of factors involved. And I think in terms of when you talk about specialty drugs, coming it from, because you have to have the insurance company pay for it. And I don't think they have a problem paying for the drug if, like you say in Gaucher's disease, it's a set population and it's 100% effective. And that, you just take it out of society that we won't pay for that. I think what they don't want is a drug that, in terms of you have to treat 100 patients to get 5 to respond. And I think if we look at how they're looking at it and saying, okay, how do we identify the patients that will respond, say 100% or even 90%? And now I think this industry is going towards biomarkers to really say, who is the patients who are going to respond? And if you talk about personalized medicine, you're pinpointing a smaller population. And if you're pinpointing a smaller population in terms of where the drug is going to work, say 90% or plus, regulatory people are going to say yes because you're kind of honing in, it's personalized medicine. The insurance companies are going to say yes because you're not treating 100 patients and 5. You're treating 10 patients and all of them, or say 9 out of 10 of them, are going to respond. And they can see pay for that, even if it's $100,000 a dose or whatever it may be, as long as it's less than what it would to have treated them if the disease had gone on to progress and the mortality rate is 100%. And I think that's what everyone has to start thinking about, as opposed to it's an orphan drug, let me just charge whatever amount they think it might be.
Yeah, I think, so the statement was, right now we're still stuck in a world where insurance companies, other payers are having to pay for treatments of patients who are not going to respond. And as the world becomes more and more personalized, we get better biomarkers, we can match treatments to patients, they'll be more willing. So for sure that's true. And where the pricing world is going, is, value-based contracting, which says, if you achieve a certain outcome in a patient, we will pay you for that. If you don't, we won't. Going at risk contracts, which says, okay, as a manufacturer, if your patient responds, you pay me. If the patient doesn't respond, you don't have to pay me. And so, these are all things that are happening. It's going to take time. They're very disease specific. So some diseases lend themselves very well to an at-risk kind of contract or a value-based approach. But you're highlighting things which are active parts of the dialogue. The point is there's a complexity behind this for each individual disease, which makes it hard to have a universal solution. But the thought's good.
So just returning back to the innovation question, it's great where people are getting into these targeted areas, more precise medicine, but I think you opened saying, about Alzheimer's, etc. So if you think about where the VC dollars are going, or where companies are building biotechs, it's all into these spaces where it's clear, there's a clear kind of target goal, maybe it's the orphan, maybe it's cancer, or whatever, everyone's doing CAR T. But some of these bigger, kind of unmet needs, we're not even talking developing world, we're thinking Alzheimer's here in the United States, for example, right? Or dementia issues, or the multiple types of dementia out there. That's hard to get funding. It's hard to find companies willing to go in that. It's a very difficult question. How would you address that? Because if you kind of put innovation on one space and kind of health system priority, you would think this is a big area, but you don't have many companies going into, in fact, the larger.
No, you're absolutely right. No, so larger pharmaceutical companies, we're extremely conservative in our thinking, right? We follow the path where, sort of proven result. I'd rather be second, third, 10th to market with something I know is going to work than take the number one. Number two, Alzheimer's is a graveyard. And, there's the amount of money that's been spent in Alzheimer's and the number of trials that have failed versus the 1, 2, 3 that have been marginally positive. And the way I look at this is, pharma is not going back into Alzheimer's until this is further de-risked. Right? And things have their moment in time. Right? I started out in 1994 working on gene therapy and cystic fibrosis. Here we are in 2018, and gene therapies are just coming to the fore. Because they're ready. The science is point, it makes sense. These are going to happen. So the Alzheimer's problem is going to be solved in the Whitehead. I mean, there'll be a new idea that's going to pop in one of these early, which is going to solve in a way, or at least give people some confidence that the reasons they've failed in the past isn't likely to be repeated. There's a reasonable expectation that this new approach will do it. So, you know, I mean, your point's exactly right, that, you know, some of these problems are so daunting that they're not getting the late stage dollars that are going to come. But the early funding, back to the NIH, the patient associations who are, you know, supporting, you know, people who are, you know, supporting and donating money to, you know, institutes like the Whitehead. I mean, you know, that part of the research equation is incredibly important.
So this isn't about drug pricing, but the higher level. You mentioned that the healthcare system is kind of broken. From your perspective, having led a big company in the industry, do we need single payer? What's your solution to our being 18% and not getting as much for our bucks as we ought to be getting?
Yeah. Okay, here it is. No, I mean, I have, you know, had the opportunity to sit in multiple different chairs through the course of my career, including starting as a physician for the first half. If you go outside the U.S., we pay the doctors much less. They get far few tests, right? I was a pulmonologist by training, right? If you came in with a cough, in all good faith, I could come up with a reason to look down your lung, you know, do a procedure, bronchoscopy, perfectly justified and charge you for it. I also, if I wanted to, could perfectly make a reason that I'm going to give you a trial of medication, see you back in 2 weeks, and not take a look. I mean, so you have to follow the money in our system, and it is, you know, unfortunately, you know, certain behaviors are incentivized. If I build a hospital, if I'm running a hospital, I get paid for the beds being full, not empty. Now, from a societal standpoint, I just assumed people were well and didn't have to be in the hospital. So I think these are our challenges. Now, I don't view it as broken in the sense that we have to start over, because we just can't get there from here, but it can be improved. But my only point and caution to everybody is, wherever you sit, whatever part of it you want to tackle, just be cognizant that it's connected to everything else, right? And so you just can't take one little slice and say, I'm going to fix this and everything else will be good. We got to work on it collectively. There's enormous money, you know, the 500 billion or whatever wasted, right? I mean, the waste equation in the 3.5 trillion is extremely high. So there's lots of opportunity, but a single payer, I think we would have a hard time getting there from here.
Yeah, I agree. So the waste is a symptom, it's not the problem. So
It's a symptom.
what one suggestion would you make?
So where would I start? Yeah. You know, so we don't have the right hospital system. So you mentioned I'm on the board of the Dimock Center. The Dimock Center is a community health center in Roxbury. They provide amazing integrated care for that community. That is high quality, incredibly efficient care. Now, if I send that same care to Partners or the Beth Israel or whatever, it will be significantly higher. So we've got to decentralize our healthcare and the role of the specialist. I mean, like I said, if you come to me as a specialist, I am going to cost you more, and you will not necessarily get better care. So I think that is a completely achievable part of this equation, which will begin to get at, and it also allows you to begin to move into preventative health, right? Because once you're providing integrated care to families, getting the kids when they're early, there's an education component there. Now you begin to tackle some of the root causes and the like, and there's nothing that any of us as stakeholders who can says, don't touch my part of the pie, can disagree with. And so I think part of our challenge is finding entry points here that we can all get around. More? Yeah.
Hi, Dave. Regards to gene therapy, you know, the way you mentioned Gaucher and all that, an enzyme replacement therapy in a way is like an annuity for a company. But with a gene therapy, for lack of better words, people be one and done. What are your thoughts on pricing on something like that?
Yeah, I mean, so gene therapy are, again, another example. I mean, they're coming out at the famous $1 million, $2 million for a treatment. If they hold their full promise for some of these rare, severe diseases, that will be an incredible bargain. The challenge for society is, do we pay, if everybody puts up their hand in the first year and you have to treat everybody. So again, we need new payment models that people are working on. Do you pay over time? Already, one or two of the companies who are in that area are entering, you're thinking about risk sharing and the like, where, if you get the result, you pay us. If you don't pay us. How long these are going to last? We know we get an effect for the ones that are being approved. Are they going to be 5 years? Are they going to be lifetime? So there's a lot to be learned about that. It's an incredibly powerful scientific, approach, and therefore, again, we need a business model, which we don't have. That's my argument today. Some of these very rare diseases, that's not a business, right? I mean, they got to go on to their next thing. I mean, they'll get a lot for a few patients, but it's not really going to sustain them as a company. So what happens after the bolus has been treated and then those other patients and that company's no longer there, who picks it up? So sustainability is a really important part of this whole equation, which is why I go back to, it needs to be backed by a business model that can support it.
Your claim that the window that you have to make the high price turn is only 2 to 2.25 years. Why not just extend that, change the patent law so that the patent starts the day the FDA gives you a license?
Yeah. No, it's, so that time period is shortening because of market forces, right? So more and more, so for those of you who are following the cancer world, the PD-1, anti-PD-1 therapies, you may have heard about amazing interventions for a small segment of the population. There's like 50 drugs, in development. That will bring enormous pressure. Those prices will come down significantly. They probably will not drop to the point of being non-viable, right? And so my plea is, again, for whenever I'm engaged in this conversation, is whatever we do, let's be thoughtful. And B, even though the system isn't working perfectly, it's working to a certain extent, and to let some of this stuff continue to play. We're a long cycle industry, right? It's not like the tech industry where, it's every 6 months and you can quickly get to your optimum maybe. Drugs come, it takes us 10 years, whatever, plus or minus for drugs. So it's going to take some time for us to massage our way into a better point of equilibrium. But again, I just think we need to allow some of these forces to work. In that world where it's shortening, the companies will survive, right? In a world where you freeze and some greater, government force says, here's what the price is, I think we destroy it.
I think I'm going to hold the questions here. We're going to have opportunity at the reception that follows for you to ask David some more questions. But first, I'd ask you to join me in thanking David for a very thoughtful. So, David, you've given us a tremendous amount to think about. It's actually interesting watching the dynamics of the questions. I think the questions were accelerating and growing in number as the session went on. So. You've clearly given us a lot to think about. And I noticed that you came today, as I did, without a tie. And so, since you are in need of a Whitehead branded tie, I would like to offer it to you, though it's really, there are very few of these. I would like to offer it to you at a very good price, David. It's clear also that we have not only a terrific speaker in David, but a terrific audience today. And I want to thank all of you for joining us, whether it's your first time here. I know there are many who are repeat attendees at Whitehead Connects. And if you have, I hope that many of you, if all of you, will return to join us for future Whitehead Connects. And in the meantime, join us for a reception, and I think David will probably be continuing to hold court there. So thank you all for joining us today. Yeah.